Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, May 21st, 2025. We are in the book of First Chronicles, chapter 27. Let's start in verse 1. This is the list of the Israelites, head of families, commanders of thousands, and commanders of hundreds, and their officers who served the king in all that concerned the army divisions that were on duty month by month throughout the year. Each division consisted of 24,000 men. So David had a standing army that had 12 divisions in it. Each division served in Jerusalem with him for 1 month and was home for the other 12 months of the year. And there's only 12 listed divisions. The Hebrews had a 13-month calendar. So he had a standing army that was, 288,000 men that were ready for battle essentially instantly. The division that was in Jerusalem was to defend the country instantly, being on quick response for guarding the country and being able to, protect it against invaders, raiders, etc., to dispense justice and to guard the palace and the city. Fortunately, during King David's reign, that was, in one sense, a boring job. There was apparently no raiding parties. There was no invaders. There was nobody attacking Jerusalem. So sometimes having a boring job in a military is a good thing. If you have excitement in the military, something's going bad for somebody somewhere. And anyway, this is the list of their leaders and how many men they had under them. And he had it organized so each division had 24,000 men. And we know the names of the leaders. And some of them, we know their second in command, and we'll talk about those when we get there. But he had it organized so that they covered the year. Verse 2. In charge of the first division for the first month was Jashabim, son of Zabdiel. There were 24,000 men in his division. He was a descendant of Perez and the chief of all the army officers for the first month, which tells us about how things were organized. He was essentially the general in charge of this division, and he had officers under him. And from the way that's said, it's implied that all the other divisions were organized the same way. This is the general that had officers under him, that had men under them, and they had different ranks and different ranks of officers. And that was implied in verse 1, where there was commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and their officers. And that implies that the commanders of hundred had officers under them. So, they had ways of organizing the army. And if there's 24,000 men, you would think this general had 24,000 commanders of 1,000. Had 24 commanders of 1,000 under him, that each had 10 commanders of 100 under them. So, that starts being 240 commanders of 100, and they having officers under them. They have people under them that help them organize their 100 people. So David has it organized. And being a man of war, you'd expect that. Verse 4. In charge of the division for the second month was Doadai the Ohahite. Mikheloth was the leader of his division. There were 24,000 men in his division. Now, Doadai is best known for being the father of one of the three mighty men. And his son doesn't appear in this list anywhere. So he was the general of it, but he had a second command, and his name was Mikloth, and he was the one that actually did the work of organizing the people. But Doadai was the man that was in charge of how you organize things and strategy, and being the general instead of being the organizer. And they basically separated those two roles most of the time. In that day and time, you did both. But for whatever reason, probably differing talents, they separated those two roles in this division. The third army commander for the third month was Benaniah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He was the chief, and there were 24,000 men in his division. This was the Benaniah who was the mighty man over the 30 and was over the 30. His son, Amizabad, was in charge of his division. Okay, I keep telling you the Benaniah was a priest. This is the verse that points out that he was a priest. If his dad was a priest, he's a priest. And Benaniah was over the 30 mighty men. He was one of the most important generals in the army. Joab was the only one that was more important. And there was points in time when Joab's brothers were also more important generals over specific things. But he had duties besides just being over this one division. And they included being in charge of the king's personal bodyguard. He also had duties at the tabernacle that was in Jerusalem that had the Ark of the Covenant in it. He may have had duties at the tabernacle in Gibeah that had the Mosaic altar at it also. Being a priest, he had priestly duties. And he was also in charge of all 12 divisions of the army. So with those kind of responsibilities, it makes sense that his son was the one that actually administered the division and did the work of organizing this division. But it probably looks better to the people of the land, the people of the division, if they had the big guy in charge and his son doing the work. And let's face it, in that day and time, with that kind of clan type division, are you going to get away with upsetting the son? Are you going to try to claim you're loyal to the father without being loyal to the son? No, you're not. You're not going to see a difference between that. It's just like if somebody was serving under Solomon when he was advisor to King David, you were also serving King David. Yeah, you knew that. That's why you served Solomon. Whether he became somebody else later is immaterial. If you were serving one of the other sons of David in some other position, you were still serving David, even if Solomon was going to become king later. So, that kind of thing applied here. The son actually did the work, while dad did other things in addition. Verse 7. The fourth month was Ashel, the brother of Joab. His son Zebediah was his successor. There were 24,000 men in his division. Ashiel, by the way, died in battle. We've covered that elsewhere. And so his son succeeded him when dad died. Verse 8. The fifth for the 5th month was the commander Shemhuth, the Israelite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 6th for the 6th month was Ira, the son of Ikish, the Tekoaite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The seventh, for the 7th month, was Helez the Pelonite, an Ephraimite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 8th, for the 8th month, was Shibbekai the Hushathite, a Zerahite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 9th, for the 9th month, was Ibizar the Anathothite, a Benjamite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 10th, for the 10th month, was Merari the Netophathite, a Zerahite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 11th, for the 11th month, was Benaniah the Parathonite, an Ephraimite. There were 24,000 men in his division. The 12th, for the 12th month, was Heldai the Netophathite, from the family of Thaniel. There were 24,000 men in his division. And if you listen carefully, some of these names are names that you've caught in the genealogies earlier in the book. Some of them are the clan or the family that they came from were important clans in specific tribes, and a lot of these divisions were a tribal division. The people in them came from mainly from a specific tribe, or at least the leadership did. And you would expect that in a clannish society, the clans would respond well to that. David used the natural divisions in the country to make his divisions and made sure everybody served equally, so to speak, and had an equal chance, that no one got left out. It covered the country evenly, all over. Everybody got a chance. And so he organized things well, and there was a rotating through. And in that day and time, you still had to run your farm. You still had to run your shepherding business. You still had to tend your olive trees or your sycamore figs or whatever else they had to do to support themselves. So you couldn't be, in one sense, a full-time soldier paid by the central government, not at this scale. So everybody got 11 months off, 12 months off out of the 13-month year to go do living things, so they supported themselves. But they were also on standby basically all the time in case there was an invasion. These 12 divisions of 24,000 men would be the fast response troops to contain the invasion while the rest of the army got called up, the rest of the recruits, the normal soldiers, so to speak, to go repel the invaders. And, yes, the 24,000 on duty, they would be, the messenger would write in and say, so-and-so invaded such and such, and they would immediately get dressed and leave and be there as fast as humanly possible for 24,000 men to be there, because they were standing around, so to speak, in their armor with their weapons sharp and ready to go. But they also sent messengers out to the other 11 divisions that says, hey, guys, get organized, get busy, meet us at such and such. We got to contain a problem. And, they were also the standing police force for the country. When David passed a judgment and there needed to be executed, these were the men that did it. And the ones from the first month handled the problems of the first month. If it carried over to the second month, they'd have to pass it off to the second group, and so on. But they were there to do the king's bidding for law enforcement, for the country. Then in verse 16, we turn a different corner. The officers over the tribes of Israel, over the Reubenites, Eleazar son of Zichri, over the Simonites, Shephatiah the son of Maacah, over Levi, Hashabiah the son of Kemuel, over Aaron, Zodak, over Judah, Elihu the brother of David, over Issachar, Omri son of Michael, over Zebulun, Ishmael son of Obadiah, over Naphtali, Jeremoth son of Azriel, over the Ephraimites, Hosea son of Azaziah, over the half tribe of Manasseh, Joel son of Pedaiah, over the half tribe of Manasseh in the Gilead, Iddo the son of Zechariah, over Benjamin, Jaasiel the son of Abner. By the way, that's the Abner son of Zer that we know as commander of Israel's forces before David. David kept it in the family. He did not diss Saul's family. He made their relatives in charge. Over Dan, verse 22, over Dan, Azrael, the son of Jehoram, these were the officers over the tribes of Israel. So he did not try to change the social order. It was a tribal country, and he just put an official over each tribe that was from that tribe, probably the natural leader of that tribe, and just made them his officer responsible for that tribe. So he didn't try to change society. He didn't try to change how people organize themselves. He used the natural leadership that was there and made them loyal to him. Verse 23, David did not take the number of men 20 years old or less, because the Lord had promised to make Israel as numerous as the stars in the sky. Joab, son of Zeruiah, began to count the men, but did not finish. Wrath came on Israel on account of the numbering, and the number was not entered in the book of the annals of the king of David. This is a slightly different accounting than just a few chapters ago when we dealt with this before. Their numbers were given, and when you look back at Samuel, a slightly different set of numbers was given. But what they're saying here is David did not, in the annals that he kept in his palace, in his reign, record that number. So they're referring to one of their sources here, and this is the first time we've come to a source. It's not named, but it is called out what it is. And I don't think it had an official name other than the Annals of King David, and it wasn't a bound book. It was probably many books, many scrolls. And it dealt with everything David did, and therefore would have been a voluminous amount of work. It'd be like trying to, say everything published by the Library of Congress in Congress's name. A Code Federal Registry is a thing, but it's not one book. It's a massive collection of information, and you can get as a bound copy this section or that section or the other section, and sometimes if you ask for a certain section, you get several bound copies. It's like that. It's all the records from his reign, and so it doesn't have a name for the book because it's not a book, but it's a collection of records. And so referring there, David did not count the number that they got. It's other places that counted that number and recorded it, and apparently that was the priest that recorded it. They were keeping up with what happened and being the counterbalance to the civil government. And so they recorded it, and they recorded David's mistakes honestly and accurately. His record counted that, yeah, it was a mistake, but because it was a mistake, David didn't record that number. Verse 25. Asmaveth, the son of Adiel, was in charge of the royal storehouses. Jonathan, son of Uzziah, was in charge of the storehouses in the outer lying districts, in the towns, the villages, and the watchtowers. Ezri, son of Caleb, was in charge of the field workers who farmed the land. Shimei the Ramathite was in charge of the vineyards. Zabdi the Shifmite was in charge of the produce of the vineyards for the wine vats. Baal Hanan the Gederite was in charge of the olive and sycamore fig trees in the western foothills. Joash was in charge of the supplies of olive oil. Shitrai the Sharonite was in charge of the herds gazing in Sharon. Shephite, the son of Adilai, was in charge of the herds of the valleys. Abil the Ishmaelite was in charge of the camels. Jehadiah the Meronothite was in charge of the donkeys. Jaziz the Hagarite was in charge of the flocks. All these were the officials in charge of King David's property. So we now have a record of who David had in charge of his property that was his, that earned him income and fed his household and kept his government running. And it took quite a collection of people, and you can see by the names, he very often picked somebody local that was an expert. The Sharonite was from Sharon. Yeah, he was local. And things like that. There have been people that criticized the scriptures that they could not be true because camels weren't in Canaan at that time, and they weren't known. Well, the Israelites had a word for it, and they used the same word from Abraham's day on through the Babylonian captivity. They may not have been native there, they may have been imported, but David had somebody in charge of his camels. And he would not have had somebody in charge of a fictional animal that they only had a name for. They understood what they were. They imported them from wherever they imported them. They may have bred them there. That's the implication. And by the way, being an Ishmaelite, the Ishmaelites have been associated with camels since apparently the time of Abraham. Ishmael apparently got involved in the camel trade, and some of his sons and his descendants became experts in camels. And all over the Middle East, up until the Babylonians ended their control over it, the Ishmaelites were in charge of camel culture from Egypt all the way up into Ukraine, into India. They were the ones known for camels. You went to the Ishmaelites, and they traveled extensively, and apparently they traveled and traded into Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia and acquired stocks there. They bred their own. They exported other places, probably exported back into Egypt. They were the camel experts. Other people had camels, yes, but ultimately, after they acquired camels and started acquiring camel herds, they were the ones that had the best quality camels, domesticated camels, They were the ones that had the best quality breeding programs. And so it's natural that David would put an Ishmaelite in charge of his camels. And therefore, he had camels. They were in Israel. Other accounts that are secular accounts give accounts of camels. The scripture gives accounts of camels. And so to say that camels weren't in Palestine at that time is ludicrous. It's not historically accurate. It's there has been archaeological evidence there was camels there. You know, even if they were an imported species and not native there, they were a useful species, and so somebody bred them. And the best historical evidence is it was mainly the Ishmaelites, and other groups probably had their own camel herds, but you know, David picks an expert, and at least some of the Ishmaelites were loyal to him. And from what we can gather, they worshiped Yahweh. By the way, the Hagarites, these are the same people that were the ancestors at the man that hated the Jews so bad in the Medo-Persian Empire that Queen Esther had to save them. And they were herdsmen in this day and time. And they were therefore a conquered people. So you begin to see, if you look at it, threads throughout history of Israel. They were they were officers in charge of David's goods. He did not treat them with ill respect. They were respected. They were business leaders, so to speak. And you also notice different things like that. You have one officer in charge of the vineyards and another one in charge of the wine vats. So one person specialized in growing the grapes, and then he picked them and passed them to the person making the wine. Now, he may have also taken some grapes and sold them as fresh grapes. He may have made dried raisins. He may have sold grape leaves, which were also used as food, etc., etc. I mean, he didn't just sell everything to the winemaker and have him make the wine, but making wine was the major thing they did with grapes. So it's a different specialty, though. And today in time, we very often have, a vineyard making its own wine, and it's a specialized process. But you also see 40, 80, 180, 120, 160, 200 acres, something like that, is the maximum you see in that, because being in charge of the growing the grapes and making the wine is more complicated. Now, if you want to make a specialized wine, you very often have to have some control over the grapes and make them there. But you'll see in those bigger vineyards, very often you have a division of labor, and somebody's in charge of making wine and somebody's in charge of growing the grapes, and they cooperate to get what needs to be done. If you look at anything larger than about 200 acres of grapes today, they divide it much differently. There is somebody in charge of growing grapes, and though they concentrate on doing the grapes the best they can and don't worry about the downstream so much. They will sell fresh, they will sell dried, they will sell to make wine, and they'll try to sell and make to each of those markets. But then you have a winemaker that buys grapes and may not be committed to buying from this guy that's got 12,000 acres completely. He'll buy, 80% from that guy and 20% from somebody else, or 10% from this guy and 5% and 3 and 1.5 and 1.5 and, and he'll mix grapes from a bunch of different places to make exactly the wine he wants. And those kind of winemakers don't grow their own grapes. That's the kind of operation David had. He had somebody in charge of making the grapes and somebody in charge of making the wine. He had enough that it was not economically viable to make somebody grow the grapes, make the wine, etc., and supply it. That would not have worked. It was a larger scale operation than that. And so you get somebody in charge of all the grapes, somebody in charge of all the wine. Likewise, there was somebody in charge of olives and sycamore figs, which were counter-cyclical in the year when they needed work and labor. And so if you worked the olive groves, if you only worked olives, you'd have a part of the year where you'd just basically sat around with not much to do. But that was the time of year the sycamore figs were needing a lot of work. And when the sycamore figs did not need work, the olive trees did. So you could do both. Now, they did not grow in the same land. So if you were going to be in charge of that, a lot of the labor force would be over here for part of the year and be over here for part of the year. And so they would move the labor force back and forth between the two different groves. Very similar skills, though, needed both places, so it made sense to put them under one man and make that work. Then you had somebody else in charge of olive oil. The people who grew the olives, again, they concentrated on growing olives, and they basically sold the olives and moved on to the sycamore figs, and somebody else pressed the oil and did all the other things you'd do with the olives to make olives that people would eat, and all the other olive products that they would have. And then the people grew the olives would go over and deal with sycamore figs and make figs the rest of the year. And picking them, drying them was a continuous process, and then you had a finished product. So David had his commercial operations organized well. Verse 32, Jonathan, David's uncle, was a counselor, a man of insight, and a scribe. Jehiel, the son of Hakmoni, was in charge of the king's sons. So he had somebody that helped raise his sons that was a good schoolmaster, if you want to think of it that way. He wasn't a father figure to these sons, but he was in charge of making sure they got the education they needed, that their talents were recognized. And in that society, you weren't trying to get a generalized education where you could do everything. They figured out very early what your talents were, and they scooted you along into what you were. And a lot of those king's sons were probably scooted along into the army, and you were going to become a warrior, because if you were going to become a king, you needed to be a warrior. So a lot of them were also probably recognized. The king needs administrators, and so king's sons are going to be administrators, and so they were trained and educated in how to administer organizations. and how to be an administrator over things. And so this is the man in charge of that. Verse 33, Ahithophel was the king's counselor. Hushai the Archite was the king's friend. Ahithophel was succeeded by Jehoiada the son of Benaniah and by Abiathar. This is, of course, when he supported the rebellion of Absalom, and after he went and committed suicide after that, so he had to have successors, and David picked two other men that had stayed loyal to him. Joab was the commander of the royal army. And so that's the list of David's officers that were involved in the court and his other government functions. David had things organized. He had capable people helping him. He had a well-functioning running government. And sure, he was involved, but these were the men that were his, so to speak, his cabinet. So you see how he organized things. Being a commander, he organized army. He organized the culture and the running of local affairs by how they naturally organized themselves. He had people that ran his commercial empire, and then he had his cabinet, so to speak, that helped him make decisions. And Joab was commander of the army, so he had in charge of these 12 divisions. He had in charge of raising an army, etc., and keeping it running and organized and fed and supplied and all that. And David was in charge of making sure everything worked and everybody worked together. You know, it wouldn't have mattered if the guy in charge of camels didn't like Joab. You know, you're going to supply the army with X many camels. You don't have to like the commander. His assistant so-and-so is going to be the one that buys them from you. You know, David would get that organized. And I'm just picking an example. We don't have any idea whether there was any divisions in there, but there obviously had to be somewhere. I mean, you have that many people in charge, you're not going to have everybody getting along perfectly. But David managed those and made sure everything functioned. Gracious Lord, thank you for showing us how a kingship works, and that King David worked things, that you had the chroniclers record this from other sources, from David's sources, possibly others. And Lord, you brought it down to us so we could understand how he organized things. Thank you for showing us that governments should function, they should have purpose, and they should focus on their purpose. Lord, I ask that you move your Holy Spirit through our land, that we have a great awakening again, that people come back to honoring you and respecting you and obeying you in large numbers again. Because all the problems in our society ultimately come down to we disagree with each other because we don't agree with each other, because we have spiritual problems and we each go our own way and we have nothing to unify us. And Lord, this country was not made to be run by a bunch of warring factions, but a unified people that obeyed their God first and then organized their government around that. And Lord, we have abandoned you and we've set ourselves up in your place and we do our own thing and we think that's freedom, and it's slavery to sin. And we need to be your people again, or you would be righteous to wipe us out for we are as sinful and as wrong as Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lord, I ask for your grace and your mercy on us, that you would send your Holy Spirit through this land again to make us your people. In your holy name, amen. I'm your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, May 21st, 2025. This was recorded on Saturday, May 17th, 2025. Personal note, I've been on vacation all week, getting a lot of rest, decaffeinated myself. I was getting to where to make it through the day, I was having to drink too much coffee, really. It's beginning to be a problem. And have gone caffeine-free for a week, or at this point, slightly over a week. Been getting much more sleep, been taking longer walks, been getting some things done around the house and other things. Have planned a little further out in the Bible studies, looking ahead. So I hope in the next couple of months we see the benefits of me having taken this week off. I hope to see you Wednesday. I hope to see you tomorrow at worship. And if not, I'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.